Look at the hands of the old man sitting on that porch. It is 1998. The Georgia sun is warm on his face. The wind is gentle in the trees, and the only sound is the rhythmic peeling of a fruit. It looks like peace. It looks like the quiet end to a long life. But inside his head, the sun never shines. Inside his head, it is always December, 1944. The peace is gone, replaced by the screaming whine of a Nebelwerfer rocket tearing through the canopy. The warmth is replaced by the biting, numbing frost of the Ardennes, where the blood freezes before it hits the snow. The silence is broken by the panic of elite German stormtroopers who are realizing, too late, that the darkness is no longer their ally. The screen goes black, because in that frozen forest, against a weapon that defied the physics of their time, they didn't just die, they evaporated. You are about to enter the scope of a ghost. This is the story of a forbidden technology, a forgotten soldier, and the night the German army learned to fear the dark dot to understand the ghost. That haunted the Ardennes in the winter of 1944. You first have to understand the man who wore the uniform. He wasn't a product of military academies, and he certainly wasn't the poster boy for the American war machine, at least not the one the propaganda reels showed back home. Let's call him Elias. Before the war, Elias wasn't a soldier. He was a problem solver in the deep rural South. He grew up in a world where silence was a currency, and the ability to see without being seen was the difference between eating dinner and going hungry. In the bayous and dense pine forests of his home, hunting wasn't a sport. It was a necessity. He learned to track possum and deer in lighting conditions that would make a city man stumble over his own feet. He learned that the woods had a rhythm, a breathing pattern, and if you stayed still enough, the forest would reveal its secrets to you. But Elias had another talent, one that made him dangerous in a way the U.S. Army hadn't anticipated. He was a tinkerer. He was the man in his town who could fix a broken ham radio with a piece of wire and a soldering iron. He understood currents, voltage, and the delicate, temperamental nature of batteries. When the war called, however, the Army didn't see a master hunter or a gifted electrical engineer. They saw a black man. In 1944, the United States military was strictly segregated. It was a contradiction of the highest order, fighting a war against Aryan supremacy in Europe while enforcing Jim Crow laws in its own barracks. Men like Elias were often relegated to support roles driving trucks, digging ditches, cooking food, or burying the dead. They were told they weren't smart enough for combat, not brave enough for the front lines, and certainly not technical enough to handle advanced weaponry. The irony was bitter and constant. While white officers debated strategy in heated tents, soldiers in units like the 761st or the volunteer infantry replacements were left to make do with hand-me-down equipment, often repairing their own trucks and radios because the supply chain deemed them a low priority. But this neglect was exactly what sharpened Elias's skills. When your radio breaks and no replacement is coming, you learn to bypass the circuits. When your flashlight dies, you learn to wire a vehicle battery to a bulb. Necessity was the mother of his invention, and segregation was the father of his resilience. By December 1944, the situation had shifted catastrophically. The Germans launched their massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes, creating the bulge in the Allied lines. Chaos reigned. The distinction between front line and rear echelon evaporated overnight. Support units suddenly found themselves holding the line against elite panzer divisions. It was in this freezing hell that Elias found himself dug into a foxhole, on the edge of a dense tree line. The cold was a physical assault, a biting, relentless pain that seeped through the thin leather of standard-issue boots. The order from high command was simple, brutal, and terrifying. Hold at all costs. There were no reinforcements coming. The white units on their flanks had either retreated or been overrun, leaving gaps in the line that the Germans were exploiting with ruthless efficiency. The nights were the worst. The Germans owned the night. Their patrols, clad in white camouflage, moved like phantoms, slitting throats and vanishing before a shot could be fired. The American soldiers were blind, huddled in their holes, waiting for death to come out of the dark. Elias sat in that darkness, his hands numb, clutching a rifle that felt like a block of ice, but his mind was working. He wasn't paralyzed by fear like the fresh recruits. He was analyzing the problem. The problem was visibility. The Germans could move because they knew the Americans couldn't see them. To survive, Elias needed an edge. He needed to change the rules of the game. His reputation as a fixer had followed him to the front. He was the guy you went to if you needed a heater rigged up or a radio frequency cleared. But what happened next wasn't about fixing a radio. It was about scavenging survival from the wreckage of defeat. 2 days into the siege, during a brief lull in the mortar fire, Elias was scouting the perimeter, looking for anything to reinforce their position, ammo, food, blankets. He came across a wrecked jeep, half buried in a snowdrift near a crater. It wasn't a standard transport. It had the markings of a forward observer unit or perhaps intelligence. The driver was dead, slumped over the wheel, frozen solid. In the back, amidst scattered maps and K-rations, sat a heavy, reinforced crate that had cracked open upon impact. Inside wasn't ammunition. It was something strange, something forbidden. It was a cumbersome, ugly piece of metal tubing attached to a heavy carbine, wired to a massive lead-acid battery pack, meant to be carried in a backpack. It was an early, highly classified infrared sniper, scope likely, the M2 or a T3 prototype. Technically, this equipment was top secret. Technically, a black soldier in a support unit wasn't even supposed to know it existed, let alone touch it. The standing orders for such technology were to destroy it, rather than let it fall into enemy hands. But Elias didn't see a classified secret. He saw a pile of glass and wires that was currently useless. He pulled the heavy scope from the crate. He checked the connection. The battery pack was damaged, leaking acid into the snow, the casing cracked by shrapnel. A normal soldier would have left it there, a piece of high-tech trash. But Elias looked at the shattered battery, then looked at the Jeep's radio battery, and then at the massive floodlight mounted on the Jeep's roll bar. The gears in his mind began to turn. He knew that infrared light was just light you couldn't see. He knew that if he could power the emitter, he could see the invisible. He dragged the heavy equipment back to his foxhole, not as a soldier following orders, but as a hunter preparing his trap. He was about to violate every safety protocol in the manual to build a weapon that would turn the Ardennes into his personal hunting ground. The sun was setting, and for the first time in weeks, Elias wasn't afraid of the dark. He was waiting for Dot to understand the sheer insanity of what Elias was attempting in that frozen foxhole. You have to understand the artifact he had dragged out of the snow. In 1944, this weapon was the stuff of science fiction. It was the M2 sniper scope, sometimes grafted onto a T3 carbine, a clumsy, ugly, terrifying precursor to the sleek night vision goggles used by modern special forces. To the untrained eye, it looked like a grotesque mutation of a rifle. Mounted on top of the receiver was a massive telescopic tube, and positioned below the barrel was a large, round emitter that looked like a car headlight painted black. It was heavy, unwieldy, and fragile, a delicate scientific instrument thrust into the brutal reality of a dirty war. But the real problem wasn't the rifle. It was the power source. The system relied on a backpack-mounted wet-cell lead-acid battery. It was a chemical nightmare strapped to a soldier's spine. If a bullet hit it, the soldier wouldn't just be shot. He would be showered in concentrated sulfuric acid. But in the Ardennes, the danger wasn't a bullet. It was the cold. The chemistry of 1940s batteries simply surrendered to the sub-zero temperatures of the Battle of the Bulge. The electrolyte inside the heavy pack had turned to sludge, rendering the top-secret weapon little more than a 20-pound paperweight. Elias sat in the bottom of his foxhole, the wind howling over the lip of the earth, examining the dead technology. He ran his cracked, shivering fingers over the cold steel of the scope. He knew what it was supposed to do. It was an active infrared system. The lamp on the bottom would shoot out a beam of infrared light invisible to the naked human eye, but bright as a spotlight to the scope on top. The scope used an electronic vacuum tube to convert that invisible light into a visible greenish image. It was a magic trick. It turned night into day, but only for the man holding the gun. However, there was a catch, a deadly flaw that made this technology forbidden in unauthorized hands. If the enemy also had infrared technology like the German Zielgert 1229, known as the Vampire, turning on that emitter was tantamount to suicide. In the infrared spectrum, Elias wouldn't be invisible. He would be walking around with a lighthouse beacon strapped to his chest. He would be the brightest thing in the forest. That was why the equipment was classified, locked away, and restricted to specific commando raids where intelligence confirmed the enemy was blind. Using it on a chaotic front line without orders was a court-martial offense. Using it when you didn't know if the Germans were watching with their own magic glass was madness. But Elias didn't care about the regulation. He cared about the footsteps he could hear crunching in the snow 300 yards away. He cared about the fact that his standard-issue rifle was useless in the pitch black. He opened the casing of the backpack battery. Dead. Frozen solid. Useless. This was where the forbiddance trick began. This was where the tinker took over. Elias knew he needed 6 volts to run the system, but he also knew that the cold increased electrical resistance. A standard 6-volt charge wouldn't be enough to push through the frozen filaments of the emitter bulb. It would just flicker and die. He needed more power. He needed to overclock the system. Crawling back to the wrecked Jeep under the cover of darkness, he didn't go for weapons. He went for the radio. The Jeep's radio system ran on heavy-duty dry-cell batteries designed to push a signal through atmospheric static. They were more stable in the cold, but their voltage was different, and their amperage was dangerously high for the delicate filaments of the sniper scope. Back in the foxhole, under a blanket to muffle the light of a small match, Elias began his surgery. He stripped the wires of the expensive, top-secret scope with his teeth. He bypassed the voltage regulator, a safety device meant to keep the vacuum tube from burning out. He was about to hot wire a delicate optical instrument directly into a high-amperage power source. It was like trying to fill a water balloon with a fire hose. If he miscalculated, the vacuum tube would implode inches from his eye, blinding him with glass and phosphorus. If the emitter bulb surged too hard, It would flashbulb burning out instantly and signaling his position to every German within a mile. This was the Forbidden's trick, bypassing the safety, ignoring the voltage limits, and pushing the technology beyond its design specifications to cut through the freezing fog. He twisted the copper wires together, wrapping them in friction tape. His hands were shaking, not just from the cold, but from the adrenaline of the gamble. He was building a bomb, and he was going to strap it to his face. He connected the dry cells in a series parallel arrangement that he estimated by gut feeling and experience would provide a surge of power strong enough to wake the machine, but just shy of destroying it. The smell of ozone and heated dust began to rise from the electronics as the circuit completed. It was a smell that didn't belong in a forest. It was the smell of a laboratory. He lifted the heavy carbine. It hummed, a high-pitched mosquito whine of the capacitors charging up. It was a sound that would have been audible in a quiet room, but outside the wind masked it. Elias pressed his eye against the cold rubber eye cup. He reached for the switch on the emitter. This was the moment of truth. If the Germans had vampire scopes, he was dead. If the bulb blew, he was dead. If the battery surged and exploded, he was dead. He took a breath that misted in the freezing air, and he flicked the switch. The darkness didn't just lift, it tore apart. Inside the scope, the world wasn't black and white. It was a ghostly, shimmering landscape of monochromatic distortion. The trees looked like skeletons dipped in phosphorescence. The snow glowed with an eerie, unnatural luminescence. And there, moving through the trees like wraiths, they were, not sounds, not shadows, men. He could see the heat of their breath. He could see the metallic glint of their rifles, which reflected the infrared beam. The Forbidden's trick had worked. The overcharged battery was pumping so much energy into the emitter that the range was double what the manual stated. He wasn't just seeing the darkness, he was dominating it. The forest of the Ardennes, a place of death and blindness for every other soul that night, had just become a shooting gallery. And Elias was the only one with the lights on. The decision to leave the foxhole was not made with the logic of a soldier following orders, but with the instinct of a hunter who realizes the den is no longer safe. Elias knew that staying static meant death. The German patrols were probing the line, tightening the noose, and eventually a grenade would roll into his hole, and it would be over. To survive, he had to hunt. But hunting with the Forbidden's trick strapped to his body was an exercise in masochism. He crawled out of the earth and into the no man's land, a stretch of frozen hill between the American and German lines. The equipment was agonizingly heavy. The jury-rigged battery pack, stuffed with the dry cells from the radio and wrapped in canvas, dug into his lower back. The wires he had spliced together dangled precariously, threatening to snag on every frozen branch. The carbine itself, top-heavy with the massive scope and the spotlight emitter, felt less like a rifle and more like a chaotic assembly of lead, pipe, and glass. Every movement had to be calculated. If he slipped on the ice, the delicate vacuum tube in the scope could shatter. If a wire pulled loose, the spark could ignite the dry pine needles, or, worse, blind him instantly. He moved into the deep tree line, about 200 yards forward of his unit's position. The forest was suffocatingly dark. It was the kind of darkness that felt heavy, pressing against the eyes, a sensory deprivation tank made of ice and fear. To the naked eye, there was nothing but black shapes against a slightly less black sky. But Elias wasn't using his naked eyes. He braced himself against the trunk of a massive oak, the bark rough and frozen against his cheek. He felt the familiar hum of the battery pack against his spine. It was getting warm, too warm. The overcharged circuit was generating heat, a ticking clock telling him that this trick wouldn't last forever. He raised the heavy carbine, settled the rubber eye cup against his socket, and flicked the switch. The world didn't appear. It materialized. It wasn't like looking through a window. It was like looking into another dimension. The view through the scope was a grainy, pulsating tunnel of green and gray. The resolution was terrible, distorted by the fish-eye effect of the primitive lens and the interference from the overjuiced battery. The trees warped at the edges of his vision. The snow on the ground didn't look white. It looked like glowing radioactive ash, but it worked. The beam of infrared light, invisible to everyone else in the forest, cut through the shadows like a lighthouse beam. He swept the rifle slowly from left to right. The forest, which had been silent and empty a moment ago, was suddenly alive with detail. He could see the texture of the bushes. He could see the wires of a trip flare the Germans had set up hours ago, and then he saw them. About 150 yards away, a German patrol was moving. There were 5 of them. Through the scope, they didn't look like men. They looked like specters. Their heavy wool coats absorbed the infrared light differently than their skin, making their faces float in the green haze like detached masks. They were moving with the arrogance of apex predators. They weren't crouching. They weren't crawling. They were walking upright, confident in the absolute cover of the night. Elias could see the vapor of their breath puffing out in rhythmic clouds, glowing bright in the IR spectrum. He could see the officer at the front checking a compass, using a red lens flashlight that was barely a spark to the naked eye, but looked like a flare through Elias's scope. The tension in Elias's chest was tighter than a drum. This was the test. If he fired and the muzzle flash gave him away, 5 submachine guns would tear his tree apart. But the trick gave him an advantage that no sniper in history had truly possessed before. He didn't have to guess. He watched them stop. They were whispering, clustered together. A fatal mistake. They believed they were invisible. Elias adjusted his aim. The crosshair in the scope was a simple black T-post, crude but effective. He didn't aim for the officer's head. That would be too quick. He needed to sow terror. He aimed for the man at the rear of the column, the one carrying the heavy MG-42 machine gun ammunition. He squeezed the trigger. The M3 carbine coughed a sharp crack that was swallowed quickly by the dense trees, but loud enough to shatter the silence. Through the scope, Elias saw the result instantly. The rear soldier didn't just fall. He crumpled as if his strings had been cut. The impact of the .30 caliber round was invisible in the dark, but the result was undeniable. The reaction of the German patrol was instantaneous chaos, but it was the kind of chaos that Elias found fascinating. Usually, when a patrol takes fire, they drop and return fire toward the muzzle flash. But Elias was deep in the brush, and he had used the thick trunk of the oak to mask the flash. The Germans dropped to the snow, but they didn't know where to look. Through the green, glowing lens, Elias watched them frantically scanning the darkness. They were blind. They were pointing their weapons in random direction, left, right, even behind them. They were screaming orders, their voices sharp and panicked. Senator, medic, Wawer, from where? Elias cycled the bolt. The brass casing pinged softly into the snow next to him. The battery pack was hot against his back now, almost burning. The image in the scope flickered, the green light pulsing as the voltage spiked. He had to be fast. He swung the barrel toward the officer. The man was crouching behind a thin sapling, thinking he was hidden. In the visible spectrum, he was. In the infrared spectrum, the sapling was transparent, and the heat of the officer's body made him glow against the cold background. Elias fired again. The officer's helmet spun off into the snow. He collapsed. Now the panic shifted to horror. The remaining 3 Germans weren't fighting a soldier anymore. They were fighting a ghost. They started firing blindly, spraying the forest with bullets. Tracers zipped through the air, bright red streaks that momentarily washed out Elias's scope, blinding him with white light. He squeezed his eyes shut, cursing, waiting for the afterimage to fade. When he looked back, the Germans were retreating. But they weren't retreating tactically. They were running. They were stumbling over roots and snowdrifts, abandoning their equipment, fleeing from a death they couldn't see. They had been the masters of the night for 5 years of war, and in 30 seconds that mastery had been ripped away. Elias didn't shoot them in the back. He didn't need to. He let them run. He needed them to go back to their lines and tell the story. He needed them to tell their comrades that the forest had eyes. He switched off the emitter. The green world collapsed back into pitch blackness. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a graveyard. Elias slumped against the tree, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He wasn't trembling from the cold anymore. He was shaking from the adrenaline overdose, a chemical cocktail of fear and godlike power. He looked down at the clumsy, ugly weapon in his hands. It smelled of ozone and burnt copper. He had broken every rule in the book to build it. He had risked a court-martial and a fiery death to use it. But as he began the slow, painful crawl back to the American lines, dragging the heavy battery through the snow, Elias realized something that changed him forever. He wasn't just a soldier holding the line anymore. He was the only man in the Ardennes who could see the truth, and the truth was that the monsters in the dark were mortal, as long as you were the one holding the light. The nights that followed were no longer a siege. They were a systematic dismantling of the German psyche. Elias had ceased to be a soldier defending a foxhole and had become something elemental, a force of nature that struck with the caprice of a lightning bolt. But survival in the Ardennes required adaptation, and Elias knew that his initial success was a double-edged sword. He had realized a fatal flaw in his forbidden trick. By mounting the infrared emitter directly on his rifle, he was essentially holding a flashlight in a dark room. To anyone without the technology, he was invisible. But if a single German sniper equipped with a vampire scope entered the sector, Elias would be a glowing bullseye. He needed to evolve. He needed to separate the eye from the light. This led to the most dangerous modification of all. Under the cover of a blizzard that turned the world into a swirling vortex of white noise, Elias crawled out to a ridge overlooking a narrow valley, a natural choke point for any armor or infantry trying to flank the American line. He didn't just bring his rifle. He dragged the heavy, salvaged spotlight from the wrecked Jeep, now severed from its mount and rewired with a long, braided umbilical cord of copper cabling he had stripped from a destroyed radio truck. He lashed the emitter to the branch of a pine tree, 20 yards to his left and 10 feet off the ground. He buried the heavy dry cell battery pack in the snow at the base of the tree to keep the reaction from freezing, insulating it with pine boughs. Then he retreated to a depression in the earth, burying himself under a white sheet, holding only the scope and the trigger. He had created a kill zone. When he threw the switch on his remote battery rig, The emitter in the tree would flood the valley with infrared light. To the naked eye, the valley would remain pitch black. To Elias, looking through his scope, it would be illuminated like a football stadium. And crucially, if the Germans did have night vision, they would fire at the glowing tree, not at the invisible man lying in the snow 20 yards away. The test came on a Tuesday night, under a moonless sky that felt like a heavy velvet shroud. Intelligence had predicted a push. The Germans were desperate to break the encirclement before the weather cleared and Allied air power returned. Elias heard them before he saw them. The sound of snow crunching under hundreds of boots, the clink of equipment, the heavy metallic groan of a mortar plate being positioned. It wasn't a patrol. It was an assault company. Through the passive darkness, he sensed the mass of humanity moving into the valley floor. He waited, his heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against the frozen ground. He waited until the sounds were directly in front of him, in the center of his trap. He flipped the switch. The valley floor exploded into green fire inside his eyepiece. The scene was apocalyptic. Dozens of German soldiers were crouched in the snow, creeping forward. He could see everything. He could see the condensation on their gun barrels. He could see the fear in their eyes as they strained to see into the dark. But Elias didn't fire at the front line. He scanned the formation, looking for the telltale signs of leadership. He looked for the map cases. He looked for the men waving hands, giving silent signals. He looked for the radio operators. The doctrine of the ghost massacre was simple. Cut off the head, and the body died. He found a Hauptmann, captain, near the rear, kneeling beside a radio operator. Elias settled the crosshair. The distance was close to 300 yards, a long shot for a carbine at night. But the trick made it feel like point-blank range. He exhaled, watching his own breath bloom green in the scope, and squeezed. The captain's head snapped back. He hit the snow without a sound. Before the radio operator could turn to see why his officer had fallen, Elias put a bullet through the radio set, shattering the vacuum tubes and killing the operator. The chain of command was severed in 3 seconds. Now the terror began. Elias worked the bolt with mechanical precision. Crack, crack, crack. He moved methodically from right to left, targeting the squad leaders, NCOs. Men were dropping in the snow, and the silence of the night was replaced by shouts of confusion. The Germans knew they were under attack, but they couldn't see the muzzle flashes. The heavy suppressor effect of the dense forest and the snow dampened the sound, making the shots seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. Panic is contagious. One German machine gunner, terrified and blind, opened fire. He held his trigger down, the MG-42 ripping a line of tracers into the darkness. It was a fatal mistake. The bright tracers revealed his position not just to Elias, but to the American mortar crews dug in half a mile behind Elias. The German muzzle flash was a beacon. Elias ignored him. The mortar would take care of him. Elias focused on the officers trying to restore order. Every time a man stood up to shout a command, he evaporated. A bullet took him out of the equation. The valley descended into absolute chaos. The Germans began firing at each other in the confusion. They threw grenades at shadows. They fired at the trees. Some of them, perhaps catching a glimpse of the infrared bloom from the decoy tree, poured fire into the pine branch 20 yards to Elias's left. The wood splintered and exploded under the hail of bullets, just as Elias had predicted. They were killing a tree while the grim reaper lay untouched in the snowdrift, harvesting their souls. Then the forbidden trick began to demand its price. Elias felt the heat before he saw the failure. The makeshift wiring running to the scope on his rifle was beginning to smoke. The overcharged voltage was melting the insulation. The smell of burning rubber and ozone cut through the crisp winter air, sharp and acrid. Inside the scope, the green image began to warp. Static lines tore across the visual field like lightning. The image pulsed, bright, dark, bright, dark. The battery was dying, but not peacefully. It was entering thermal runaway. The heavy pack of dry cells he had jury-rigged was cooking itself alive. He had 3 rounds left in his magazine. There were still 20 Germans in the killing zone, now retreating in a disorganized mob. The image in the scope flickered violently, and then shrank to a tiny pinprick of green light. Then blackness. The scope was dead. The magic was gone. Elias was suddenly just a man in the dark again. But the battle wasn't over. A stray group of 3 Germans, sprinting away from the mortar fire that was now raining down on the valley, was charging directly toward his position. They didn't see him, but they were going to trip over him in seconds. Elias ripped the heavy, useless scope off the top of the carbine, the metal searing hot against his gloves. He threw the optical instrument aside. It was dead weight now. He didn't have night vision anymore. He had ears, and he had a knife. The first German loomed out of the darkness, a shape darker than the night. Elias didn't shoot. He didn't want the muzzle flash to reveal his position to the others. He rose from the snow like a corpse waking up. He swung the stock of the carbine with all the force of his terrified adrenaline, connecting with the German's helmet. The man went down with a grunt. The second German turned, hearing the impact. Elias fired his last 3 shots from the hip point blank. The flashes were blinding, searing his own retinas, destroying his natural night vision. Click. Empty. The third German was on him. Elias could smell the unwashed wool and the fear on the man. They grappled in the snow, rolling over the frozen roots. The German was strong, desperate. Elias's hand found the handle of his trench knife. It wasn't technology that saved him in that final moment. It wasn't the battery or the scope or the radio parts. It was the bayou. It was the instinct of a hunter who knows how to finish the kill when the gun is empty. The struggle was short, brutal, and silent. Elias lay in the snow, gasping for air, the steam rising from his body. The valley below was a smoking ruin. The American mortar had finished what his sniper fire had started. The German offensive had been broken before it even began, dissolved by a phantom force. The forbidden trick lay smoking in the snow next to him, a melted pile of useless junk. The decoy tree was shredded. The batteries were dead. But as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon, revealing the field of bodies frozen in the strange postures of sudden death, Elias knew the truth. The equipment had failed, but the legend had been born. The patrols hadn't just been defeated. In the minds of the survivors, they had been erased by the forest itself. Dawn broke over the Ardennes with a gray, lethargic reluctance, as if the sun itself was ashamed to look down at what had happened in the night. The snow, which had been pristine and white the evening before, was now a tapestry of violence. But it was a strange, silent kind of violence. Usually, the morning after a major assault, the battlefield is a chaotic mess of churned earth, overlapping craters and bodies strewn in the desperate, sprawling postures of men who died running or fighting hand to hand. But the valley floor that morning looked less like a battlefield and more like a crime scene. Lieutenant Miller, a white officer from the headquarters company who had come up to assess the line, walked through the knee-deep snow with the look of growing confusion on his face. He had expected to find the colored support troops overrun. He had expected to find a breach in the line that would need to be plugged with reserve armor. Instead, he found a graveyard of the German elite. He walked past the body of a German machine gunner. The man was slumped over his weapon, frozen in place. There was a single neat hole in the center of his helmet. Miller walked another 10 yards. A German officer lay on his back, eyes open, staring at the gray sky. A single hole in the chest. Miller stopped and turned a slow circle. There were dozens of them, and as he looked closer, the anomaly of the scene began to disturb him. There were no shell casings from American rifles near the bodies. There were no scorch marks from flares on the ground. The snow around the Germans was undisturbed by close quarters struggle. These men hadn't been killed in a brawl. They had been executed. But executed from where? The American line was 300 yards away, behind a dense curtain of pine trees. To make these shots in the daylight would have been a feat of marksmanship. To make them in the pitch black of a moonless winter night, without using flares to illuminate the targets, was ballistically impossible. It defied the laws of physics as Miller understood them. The valley was silent, save for the cawing of crows that were beginning to circle, drawn by the scent of death that the cold could not entirely mask. Back at the prisoner-holding area, a hastily erected barbed wire pen behind the supply tents. The atmosphere was thick with a specific, palpable dread. The few German survivors who had surrendered or been captured in the retreat were not behaving like typical prisoners of war. Usually, captured soldiers are sullen, relieved to be alive, or defiant. These men were trembling. They huddled together, refusing to look at the dark tree line. An intelligence officer, a captain fluent in German, was trying to conduct an interrogation. He was getting frustrated. He wanted to know about troop movement, about the armor reserves, about the supply lines. But the German-felled Weeble, sergeant, he was questioning, wouldn't talk about tanks. He would only talk about the eyes. "Nicht Menschen," the German whispered, his hands shaking around a tin cup of coffee. "Not men. Tell him to stop talking nonsense," the captain snapped at the translator. "Ask him how many panzers are in the sector." The translator listened to the German's hurried, whispered reply, and his face went pale. "Sir, he says they didn't fight soldiers. He says they were fighting a Schwarzer Geist, a black ghost. He says the forest opened up and swallowed them. He says they saw eyes, green eyes, burning in the dark. He says they shot at the eyes, but the bullets went through them." The captain scoffed, lighting a cigarette to mask his own unease. Battle fatigue, mass hysteria. They got hit by lucky mortar fire, and they're making up ghost stories to cover their embarrassment. But the German sergeant grabbed the translator's sleeve, his eyes wide and bloodshot. 9, no mortar, no flash, just the click. And then Hans is dead, just the click. And then the Hauptmann is dead. It was the devil, the black devil. While the intelligence officers dismissed the ravings of traumatized prisoners, a different kind of confrontation was happening at the edge of the foxholes. Alias sat on a crate of rations, cleaning the soot from his hands. He looked like a man who had walked through a furnace. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. Beside him, on a poncho spread over the snow, lay the remains of the forbidden trick. It looked like a pile of junk. The scope was cracked. The wiring was melted and fused together in a lump of black plastic and copper, and the heavy battery pack was leaking a dark, corrosive fluid into the snow. A jeep pulled up, tires crunching aggressively on the ice. 2 MPs jumped out, followed by a colonel from the logistics division. The colonel didn't look at the dead Germans in the valley. He looked at Elias and then he looked at the pile of equipment. He didn't see the genius of the modification. He didn't see the engineering miracle that had saved the line. He saw a violation of protocol. He saw a piece of top-secret, classified hardware that had been tampered with by a soldier who wasn't even supposed to be touching it. "Is that the T3 unit?" the colonel asked, his voice sharp and accusatory. He pointed at the ruined scope. Elias didn't stand up immediately. He was too tired. He slowly wiped his hands on a rag. "It was, sir. Battery was dead. I had to improvise." The colonel stepped forward, kicking the melted battery pack with the toe of his boot. "Improvise? You destroyed government property, soldier. That is an experimental optical device. Do you have any idea of the cost of that unit?" Elias looked up, his expression unreadable. "I know the cost, sir. It cost about 3 radio batteries and a roll of tape, and in exchange you got 100 dead Germans and a held line. I'd say the Army got a bargain." The colonel's face reddened. The insubordination was breathtaking, but the evidence was undeniable. He looked out toward the valley, where the burial details were starting to drag the frozen bodies into stacks. He knew intellectually that this soldier had done something impossible. He realized that this black soldier had effectively single-handedly broken a German assault using broken equipment, and that was the problem. It didn't fit the narrative. The Army in 1944 wasn't ready to hear that a support soldier from a segregated unit had out-engineered the signal corps and outfought the infantry. It was messy. It raised questions about why these troops were being used for manual labor. It raised questions about the safety protocols of the equipment. "Confiscate it," the colonel ordered the MPs. The MPs moved in, gathering up the rifle, the scope, and the ruined battery rig. They handled it carefully, as if it were radioactive. "Sir," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm, "the Germans, they have their own version, the vampire. If they find out we can rig these up to see them—" "You will not speak about this," the colonel interrupted, stepping close to Elias, looming over him. "You will not speak about what you did to this equipment. You will not tell the other men how you wired those batteries. That is a direct order. If you mention this modification, you'll be court-martialed for destruction of classified material and endangering your unit with unauthorized explosives. Do you understand me?" Elias watched them shove the tangled mess of wires into a canvas bag. They were taking his magic. They were taking the thing that had made him a god for 3 nights. But as he looked at the bag, he realized they were also taking the evidence. They were scrubbing the record. "I understand, sir," Elias said. The colonel nodded, satisfied that the hierarchy had been restored. "Good. Get back to your duties. There are trucks that need unloading." The jeep sped away, taking the forbidden trick back to a command tent, where it would likely be catalogued as battle-damaged, destroyed, and thrown into a scrap heap, its secrets melting away with the winter snow. Elias was left alone on the edge of the line. He watched the burial detail working in the valley. He saw them stop occasionally to look at a German corpse, pointing at the single impossible bullet hole, shaking their heads in disbelief. They would never know about the overcharged batteries. They would never know about the decoy tree. In the official reports filed later that week, the repelling of the German counter-attack in that sector was attributed to heavy mortar concentration and disciplined rifle fire. The specific, terrifying accuracy of the defense was smoothed over, averaged out into the statistical noise of war. The German prisoners were transferred to the rear, and their stories of the black ghost with the green glowing eyes were dismissed as a delirium of defeated men. But the silence that settled over the Ardennes that morning was different. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a secret that everyone knows but no one is allowed to say. The white officers knew something unexplainable had happened. The German survivors knew they had met a supernatural force, and Elias, standing in the cold, knew that he had touched the future of warfare, held it in his hands for a few fleeting nights, and then watched it be confiscated by men who were too small to understand it. He picked up a crate of rations and hoisted it onto his shoulder. The ghost was gone. The soldier remained. The snows of the Ardennes eventually melted, revealing the scarred earth beneath, and the war moved on. It rolled across the Rhine, into the heart of Germany, and finally to the rubble of Berlin. But for Elias, the war didn't end with a treaty signed in a schoolhouse. It ended with a quiet boat ride back across the Atlantic, back to a country that viewed him not as the phantom who had held the line against the Wehrmacht, but simply as a colored man who needed to know his place. There were no medals for what happened in that valley. The official combat logs made no mention of unauthorized modifications to classified experimental equipment. To acknowledge the forbidden trick would have been to acknowledge two things the Army was desperate to ignore: that their expensive technology was flawed, and that a black soldier from a support unit had possessed the tactical genius to fix it. So the story was scrubbed. The ghost of the Ardennes was filed away under standard infantry defense. Elias returned to the deep south, to the humid heat and the buzzing cicadas, trading his modified carbine for a toolbox and eventually a rocking chair. He lived through the civil rights movement, watching men march for dignity, all while carrying a secret that proved his worth 1,000 times over. He watched the news in the decades that followed. He saw the wars in Korea, in Vietnam, and the Gulf. He saw soldiers wearing advanced night vision goggles, sleek, lightweight, green phosphor marvels that turned the night into day. He watched the world marvel at the technology, calling it a modern revolution. But Elias would just smile a thin, knowing smile. He knew that the revolution hadn't started in a laboratory in the 1980s. It had started in a frozen foxhole in 1944 with a dead radio battery and a roll of friction tape. This is why you won't find this specific account in the high school history books. History is a narrative written by the victor, but it is edited by the bureaucrats. The bureaucrats didn't want a hero who broke the rules. They wanted a clean, sanitized version of the war, where the equipment worked as advertised and the lines of segregation were justified by competence. Elias's story was an anomaly. It was a glitch in the system. It was a moment where desperation and brilliance intersected to create a weapon that shouldn't have existed for another 30 years. It was an inconvenience to the official record, so it was allowed to evaporate, just like the German patrols that walked into his kill zone. And that brings us back to the porch. Back to 1998. The old man stops peeling his orange. The wind shifts, rustling the leaves of the oak tree in his yard. But if you look closely at his eyes that are now cloudy with age, perhaps hiding the onset of cataracts, you realize he isn't looking at the oak tree. He isn't seeing the vibrant green of a Georgia summer. He is seeing a different kind of green, a grainy, pulsating, electric green. He can still feel the phantom weight of the heavy battery pack against his spine. He can smell the ozone of the frying circuit. In the quiet of his own mind, the birdsong fades away, replaced by the crunch of boots on snow and the high-pitched whine of a capacitor charging up. He blinks, and for a split second, the daylight vanishes. The world is dark again, And in that darkness he is young, he is powerful, and he is the only thing the monsters fear. He takes a bite of the orange, the sweetness cutting through the memory of the cold. He never told his children the details. He never told his wife about the night the forest had eyes. Some burdens are too heavy to share, even after the batteries have long since died. But he remembers. He remembers that for 1 week in December he made the impossible happen. History may have forgotten the forbidden trick. It may have erased the technical specs and buried the reports. But the legacy remains in the silence of that valley in Belgium, where the trees still grow over the graves of men who never knew what killed them. They didn't just die in a firefight. They walked into a future they weren't ready for, and they simply ceased to exist. If you believe that history is defined not just by the generals in the maps rooms, but by the forgotten soldiers in the foxholes who improvised survival with their bare hands, then you are in the right place. There are thousands of stories like Elias's tales of ingenuity, courage, and terror that were classified, ignored, or lost to time. We are going to find them. We are going to tell them. Subscribe to the channel and join us as we turn on the light in the dark corners of history. Because the water was red, the snow was white, but the truth is always in the dark.